Edward Hale noticed it the moment he pushed open the heavy oak door. The hinges groaned like something waking from a long sleep. A cold breath of air drifted out to meet him, carrying the scent of mildew, ink, and time itself. He stepped inside. Rows of iron shelves stretched through the dim room like narrow streets in a silent city. Candlelight flickered from the desk near the window, throwing long shadows that crawled across the cracked stone floor. Outside, rain tapped softly against the tall glass panes. The steady rhythm sounded almost like fingers drumming in impatience. Edward brushed dust from his coat sleeve and inhaled slowly. The air was thick enough to taste, dry parchment mixed with the faint metallic scent of rusting hinges. "Late again, Mr. Hale?" came a voice from the back. Old Miriam Whitlock sat behind the main desk, wrapped in layers of wool like a bundled secret. Her spectacles hung low on her nose, and her pen scratched across a ledger with slow precision. Edward smiled faintly. "You know me," he said, removing his hat. "History doesn't keep office hours." Miriam snorted softly. "History rarely pays the bills either." Edward walked deeper into the archive, his boots echoing quietly on the stone floor. The sound bounced off the tall ceilings and vanished among the stacks. He had come for one reason. 3 days earlier, while studying architectural records from the early 1800s, Edward had discovered something strange. Buildings that seemed impossibly large, doors towering 15 feet high, staircases wider than city streets, windows shaped like cathedral arches on what were supposedly ordinary homes. At first he thought it was exaggeration. Artists liked drama. But then came the photographs. The proportions didn't make sense. Humans standing beside the structures looked small, uncomfortably small. Edward reached shelf C1, 7, and ran his fingers along the spines of ancient record boxes. The cardboard felt brittle and cold against his skin. Somewhere in these records were the original construction documents. The truth had to be here. He pulled down a large file labeled Urban Reconstruction, 1816. Dust puffed into the air as he opened it. Inside were maps, blueprints, letters, and something else. Edward froze. At the bottom of the folder lay a photograph, not a drawing, not a sketch. A real photograph. The edges were curled with age, but the image was still clear. It showed a massive stone building under construction. Workers stood near its foundation, their hats tilted against the sun. Edward leaned closer. The candlelight flickered across the photo, revealing details slowly. The workers. They weren't building the structure. They barely reached the height of the first stones. Edward felt a chill crawl up the back of his neck. Each stone block was taller than a man, much taller. Then he noticed something else. Near the edge of the photograph stood a figure partially hidden behind scaffolding, a silhouette. It was easily twice the height of the workers. Edward's pulse began to race. He lifted the photo closer to the candle. The paper trembled slightly between his fingers. Behind him, the archive door creaked open. Cold air rushed in. Edward turned. "Miriam?" he called. No answer. Only the sound of slow footsteps entering the archive. And then a voice he had never heard before whispered from the darkness. "You were not supposed to find that photograph." Edward's heart stopped, because the voice sounded impossibly deep and impossibly large. What exactly had vanished after 1800? Before we go deeper, understand this. This story isn't for everyone. If you're still here, you're one of the few who can face what America buried. Subscribe now, and tell me in the comments, what state are you listening from? And would you dare hear this story from your own backyard? The candle flame trembled, and for a moment the entire archive seemed to breathe with it. Shadows stretched along the shelves like tall figures leaning closer to listen. "You were not supposed to find that photograph." The deep voice echoed again. Edward swallowed. His mouth tasted dry, like chalk dust. "Who's there?" he called. His voice sounded small in the enormous room. The rain outside grew heavier. Drops hammered against the tall windows, creating a hollow drumming that filled the silence. No answer came, only the slow creak of the archive door closing behind him. Edward turned toward the entrance. The wooden door now stood shut. The iron latch had fallen into place with a dull clink. He had not heard anyone walk past him. A cold draught brushed against his neck. Edward felt the hairs on his arms rise beneath his coat. "Miriam," he tried again. Still nothing. He stepped forward cautiously, the photograph still clutched in his hand. The stone floor felt colder through the thin leather of his boots. Every step echoed. Every sound seemed louder than it should be. Halfway across the archive, he stopped. There was another sound now. Breathing. Slow. Heavy. It didn't sound like Miriam's gentle wheeze. It sounded deeper. Much deeper. Edward turned slowly toward the shelves behind him. Between two towering rows of documents, something moved. Not quickly, not clearly, just enough to disturb the darkness. Edward lifted the candle from a nearby desk and held it forward. The flame threw trembling light into the narrow aisle. The shelves stretched upward nearly to the ceiling. Dust drifted in the golden glow like floating ash. "Show yourself," Edward said. The words felt brave in his mouth, but his hands were trembling. For several seconds, nothing happened. Then, a sound. Thud. Edward flinched. It was not the sound of footsteps. It was heavier, like something enormous shifting its weight. The wooden shelves creaked. A faint smell drifted through the air now. Not dust, not mold. Something earthy. Wet soil. Mud. Edward's eyes narrowed. Mud. That made no sense. The archive had been sealed for decades. No one tracked mud inside here. Then the candlelight caught something strange on the floor. A mark. A footprint. Edward crouched slowly. The print was pressed into the thin layer of dust covering the stone. But it wasn't normal. It was huge. Nearly twice the length of Edward's boot, and deeper than any human step could press into stone dust. His pulse pounded in his ears. Behind him, something shifted again. Edward stood quickly and spun around. The candle flame jumped violently. For the briefest moment, he saw it. A shape rising behind the shelves. Tall, unnaturally tall. The top of the shadow nearly touched the ceiling beams. Edward stumbled backward, his shoulder slamming into a wooden cabinet. The photograph slipped from his fingers and fluttered to the floor. The shadow moved. Slowly. And then a massive hand reached from the darkness and picked up the photograph. Edward's blood turned cold, because the hand holding it was easily 3 times the size of his own. The deep voice spoke again. "You humans were never meant to remember." The candle suddenly went out. Darkness swallowed the archive, and Edward heard something enormous begin walking toward him. Were giants real, and had someone been hiding them for centuries? Edward couldn't see his own hands. The smell of dust, wet earth, and ancient paper filled his lungs as he stood frozen. His heart hammered so loudly he feared the thing in the darkness could hear it. Then it came again. Thud. The floor trembled faintly. A step. Not the step of a man. Something heavier, something massive. Edward's throat tightened. Another step followed. Thud. Closer this time. Edward forced himself to breathe slowly. The air tasted dry and bitter on his tongue. Think. Think. His hand moved blindly along the edge of the desk beside him. His fingers brushed against cold metal, the candle holder. But the flame was gone. "Stay calm," he whispered to himself. The voice in the darkness answered, "You should not have come here, Edward Hale." Edward's body went rigid. It knew his name. A shiver crawled along his spine. "How do you know me?" he asked, trying to keep his voice steady. Silence followed. Then the deep voice returned, quieter this time. "We know all who search the old records." Another step. Thud. The sound echoed through the archive like distant thunder. Edward's mind raced. The shelves around him were tall but narrow. If the thing approaching truly was as large as the shadow he saw, it wouldn't fit easily between them. That meant one thing. He still had time to move. Slowly, carefully, Edward slid his hand across the desk until he felt a small wooden box. Inside it were matches. His fingers trembled as he opened it. Behind him, the breathing grew louder. Heavy, slow, like a bellows feeding a furnace. Edward struck a match. The tiny flame burst to life. For a brief second, golden light filled the archive. Edward turned, and the match almost fell from his hand. Standing at the far end of the aisle was a man. At least, it looked like a man. But something was terribly wrong. The figure had bent slightly beneath the low beams of the archive ceiling. Its shoulders were enormous. Its head nearly brushed the hanging lantern hooks above. The man's coat looked centuries old, thick and dark with mudstains along the bottom. The smell of damp soil filled the air around him. Edward's eyes widened. "You," Edward whispered. The giant figure stared down at him calmly. Its eyes reflected the match flame like two dark mirrors. "You were curious," the giant said. The voice vibrated through the room, low and ancient. "But curiosity has consequences." Edward took a step back, the match trembling in his fingers. "You're real." The giant tilted his head slightly. "We were always real." The match burned closer to Edward's fingers. Heat licked his skin. He barely noticed. "Then why did you disappear?" Edward asked, his voice shaking. The giant was silent for a moment. Then it said something that made Edward's blood run cold. "We didn't disappear." The match flame flickered violently. The giant stepped forward. Thud. Dust fell from the ceiling beams. "We were buried." Edward blinked. "Buried?" The giant slowly lifted the photograph in its enormous hand. "After the mud." The match burned out. Darkness returned instantly, and just before Edward could strike another one, he heard something else. Not one set of footsteps. Many, heavy, approaching the archive from outside. How many giants were still walking the earth, hidden beneath history itself? Disclaimer: this story is purely fictional. Any resemblance to real people, places, or events is entirely coincidental. Chapter 4. The Night of Many Footsteps. The darkness inside the archive felt heavier now. Edward struck another match with shaking fingers. The tiny flame flared to life again, casting trembling light across the shelves. Dust drifted slowly through the air like tiny ghosts. The giant still stood before him. Massive, silent, watching. But now Edward heard it clearly. Outside the archive walls, thud, thud, thud. More footsteps, each one heavy enough to vibrate through the stone floor beneath his boots. Edward's mouth went dry. "How many of you are there?" he asked. The giant didn't answer immediately. Instead, it slowly turned its head toward the tall window at the end of the archive. Rain streaked down the glass like silver lines. Another set of footsteps passed outside. Closer now, the giant spoke quietly. "More than you would believe." Edward felt a chill crawl through his chest. His mind struggled to make sense of it. If giants were real, if they never disappeared, then history itself was wrong. Or worse, it had been changed. "Why are you here?" Edward asked. The giant's enormous hand rested against one of the shelves. The old wood groaned softly under the weight of its touch. "We came for the photograph." Edward's eyes widened. "The one I found?" The giant nodded slowly. That record was never meant to survive. Edward glanced toward the floor where the folder had spilled open earlier. Old maps and documents still lay scattered across the stone. "Why hide it?" Edward asked. The giant's deep eyes darkened. "Because it proves the world before the mud." Edward felt the words settle into the room like a stone dropped into deep water. "The mud flood," Edward whispered. The giant studied him carefully. "You already know the name." "I've heard the theory," Edward said. "Cities buried, buildings half-covered, history rewritten." The giant's expression hardened. "Not that—" Worried another thunderous step shook the ground outside. Edward's match burned low again. "What happened after 1800? He asked quickly. "Why did giants vanish?" The giant leaned closer. Edward could now see the rough texture of the giant's skin, like stone weathered by centuries. A faint smell of earth and rain surrounded him. "When the mud came," the giant said slowly, "the world changed." The match burned closer to Edward's fingers. "What do you mean?" The giant looked toward the ceiling as if remembering something ancient. "The cities were buried overnight." Edward's breath caught. Entire civilizations disappeared beneath rivers of mud. Edward's heart pounded. "Then why don't people remember?" The giant's eyes locked onto his. "Because someone made sure they wouldn't." At that moment, the archive door exploded open. A blast of cold wind rushed inside, blowing papers into the air. Edward spun around. Several men stepped through the doorway. They wore long black coats soaked with rain. Lanterns glowed in their hands, casting sharp golden light across the room. One of them raised a strange metal device, something that looked like a rifle but far more complex. The man's voice was calm and cold. "Step away from the giant, Mr. Hale." Edward froze. "How do you know my—" The man smiled faintly. "We've been watching you for weeks." Behind Edward, the giant slowly straightened to its full, towering height. The men lifted their weapons. The leader spoke again. "You were never supposed to meet them." Edward's stomach dropped, because the man's coat carried a symbol stitched onto the collar, a symbol Edward had seen before, on secret government records. 3 interlocking triangles, the mark of the Historical Preservation Authority, and according to every official document, that organization had been shut down in 1834. So why were its agents standing in the archive tonight? And why were they hunting giants? What exactly had the world been hiding for over 200 years? Chapter 5. The Authority's Secret. The rain roared against the archive windows. Wind rushed through the open door, scattering brittle papers across the stone floor. Lantern light from the men in black coats stretched long shadows between the towering shelves. Edward's heart hammered in his chest. 3 men stood at the doorway. Each held one of the strange rifle-like weapons aimed directly at the giant behind him. The leader stepped forward slowly. Water dripped from the brim of his hat, tapping against the stone like a ticking clock. "Mr. Hale," he said calmly, "step aside." Edward didn't move. Behind him, the giant remained silent, towering like a dark monument in the flickering light. "You're from the Historical Preservation Authority," Edward said carefully. The man's faint smile returned. "So, you've done your research?" Edward's throat tightened. "That organization was dissolved in 1834. The man chuckled softly. "That's what the public record says." Another thunderous step sounded outside the building. Edward turned slightly. Through the rain-streaked window, he saw a massive shadow move past the glass. Another giant. Maybe more. The leader followed Edward's gaze and sighed. "Yes," he said quietly. "They're gathering." The giant behind Edward spoke for the first time since the men entered. "You should leave," the giant said. Its voice rumbled through the room like distant thunder. The agents raised their weapons higher. The leader's expression hardened. "That will not be happening." Edward noticed something strange now. The weapons in their hands weren't normal rifles. Thin copper coils wrapped around the barrels. Glass tubes filled with glowing blue liquid pulsed along the sides. Edward whispered, "What are those?" The leader answered casually, "Containment tools." The giant's massive hand slowly clenched into a fist. "You mad?" "Ian weapons," the giant said. The leader tilted his head slightly. "Only if you resist." The air in the archive felt thick enough to choke on. Edward could smell wet earth, candle smoke, and something metallic from the strange machines. "You've been hiding them," Edward said. The leader looked amused. "Hiding them?" He shook his head. "No, Mr. Hale." He stepped closer. "We've been managing them." Edward felt a cold knot form in his stomach. "Managing?" The man gestured toward the giant. "For 2 centuries we've kept the balance." Another giant shadow passed across the window. Edward's pulse quickened. "What balance?" The man's voice dropped lower. "The balance between your world." He glanced at the towering figure behind Edward. "And theirs." The giant stepped forward suddenly. The floor groaned under the weight. "You buried our cities," the giant growled. The agents tightened their grip on their weapons. The leader did not flinch. "We preserved human civilization." Edward blinked. "Preserved it from what?" The leader looked directly at him. "From extinction." Lightning flashed outside, illuminating the room for a split second. Edward saw something terrifying through the window. Dozens of giant silhouettes standing in the rain, watching the archive, waiting. Edward's voice trembled. "How many of them are left?" The leader answered quietly. "More than we can control." The giant behind Edward spoke again. "And tonight," it said slowly, "we take the truth back." The agents raised their weapons. Blue light crackled through the copper coils. The leader gave a single command. "Fire!" And at that exact moment, the entire archive building shook violently, as if something enormous had slammed into the outer wall. Books crashed from the shelves. Glass shattered. Edward stumbled. Outside, something even larger than the giant roared in the storm. If giants were real, what could possibly be big enough to hunt them? Chapter 6. The Beast Beneath the Storm. The archive walls trembled like paper in a hurricane. Edward grabbed the edge of a shelf to keep from falling as books crashed around him. Dust burst into the air, filling his mouth with the bitter taste of ancient paper. Outside, thunder rolled across the sky. But this sound was different, deeper, alive. Another violent impact struck the building. Boom! The stone walls groaned. The agents staggered but kept their weapons raised. Blue energy crackled along the copper coils of their strange rifles, casting sharp flashes of light across the chaos. "What was that?" Edward shouted. The leader of the authority turned slowly toward the shattered window. For the first time since entering the archive, the calm expression on his face cracked. "That," he said quietly, "is not supposed to be here." Edward stumbled toward the broken window. Cold rain lashed against his face as he looked outside. The sight froze the breath in his lungs. Dozens of giants stood in the muddy street beyond the archive, their enormous silhouettes rising through the storm like ancient statues come to life. But they weren't looking at the building. They were looking behind it, waiting, watching. Then Edward saw it. At the far end of the street, the ground moved. Not slightly. The entire earth shifted. Cobblestones cracked and lifted as something enormous pushed upward from beneath the mud-covered road. A low roar vibrated through the ground. The smell hit Edward next. Wet earth. Rot. Something ancient. The mud bulged upward like a rising wave. And then, something broke through the surface. A massive shape emerged from the ground. Edward's eyes widened. It wasn't a giant. It was far larger. A creature covered in thick, cracked skin, the color of dark clay, pulled itself from the earth. Mud slid off its body in heavy chunks. Its back rose higher than the rooftops. Its long limbs dug into the ground like pillars. Two glowing eyes opened slowly in the rain. The creature roared again. The sound shook the entire city. Behind Edward, the giant inside the archive spoke in a low, fearful voice. "It has awakened." Edward turned quickly. "What is it?" The giant's face looked grim. "One of the buried." The authority agents exchanged uneasy glances. The leader cursed under his breath. This wasn't supposed to happen yet. Edward stared at him. Yet? Another roar split the air outside. The creature took a step forward. The ground cracked beneath its weight. Giants in the street began moving backward slowly, their massive figures suddenly looking far less confident. Edward whispered, "You mean there are more of those things?" The leader nodded grimly. "Yes." Lightning flashed across the sky. For a split second, Edward saw the creature's full shape. Its body looked like a mountain of living stone, and something even more terrifying was chained around its neck. A massive iron collar, covered with the same symbol as the authority. 3 interlocking triangles. Edward's mind spun. "You didn't just hide the giants." He looked at the leader in horror. "You were keeping those things imprisoned." The man didn't deny it. Another giant crash echoed through the street as the creature tore part of an old building from the ground. The leader raised his weapon again. "Everyone step back." Edward stared at him. "You can't stop that thing with a rifle." The man smiled grimly. "This isn't for the creature." Edward felt a sudden cold fear. "Then who is it for?" The leader pointed the glowing weapon directly at the giant standing behind Edward. "For them." Edward's stomach dropped. Because outside, the creature turned its massive glowing eyes toward the line of giants and began moving straight toward them. Were the giants running from the monsters, or had they accidentally awakened something far worse than themselves? Chapter 7. The Chains of the Buried. Rain hammered the broken windows of the archive. Lightning tore across the sky, illuminating the muddy street outside like flashes from a dying sun. Edward could barely breathe. The enormous creature moved slowly through the storm, its massive limbs crushing stone and wood beneath each step. Every movement made the ground shudder. Outside, the giants began to spread apart. Some stepped backward, others stood their ground. The giant inside the archive stared through the shattered window, its enormous shoulders tense. "It has been centuries," the giant murmured. Edward turned to him. "You know that thing?" The giant's deep eyes remained fixed on the creature outside. "We fought them before the mud." Edward felt the words sink into his chest. Before the mud. Before the buried cities. Before history changed. Another roar shook the air. The creature dragged its heavy body forward, iron chains clanking around its neck. Each link was thicker than a man's arm. Edward stared. The collar around its neck glowed faintly with strange markings. The same symbol again. 3 interlocking triangles, the mark of the authority. Behind Edward, the leader of the agents raised his weapon higher. Blue energy pulsed along the coils. "Stand down," he commanded the giant. The giant didn't move. "You should be aiming that at the monster," Edward shouted. The leader's voice remained cold. "You still don't understand." Edward looked at him. "The giants aren't the victims here." Another thunderous crash echoed outside as the creature smashed through a carriage, wood splintered like twigs. Edward turned back toward the window. The giants had formed a wide circle around the creature now. One of them stepped forward. This giant was even larger than the one inside the archive. Its massive silhouette rose nearly as high as the rooftops. It carried something enormous. The 2 colossal beings collided with a deafening crash. The guardian's spear slammed into the creature's thick hide. The creature roared in fury, swiping one enormous arm across the street. Buildings collapsed like toys. Edward staggered backward from the window. The entire archive shook violently. Books rained down from the shelves. The authority agents steadied themselves. The leader spoke sharply. "This is escalating too quickly." Edward stared at him. "You chained that thing underground." "Yes," the man replied calmly. "And now the giants have awakened it." Edward blinked in disbelief. "You're blaming them?" The leader's expression hardened. "You think this is the first time the giants tried to reclaim the surface?" Edward froze. "What do you mean?" The man stepped closer. "For 200 years we've kept them below." Edward's stomach twisted. "Below?" Another violent roar shook the building. Outside, the guardian giant was now wrestling the creature in the mud-filled street. The monster snapped its massive jaws toward the giant's shoulder. Edward turned slowly toward the giant inside the archive. "You said your cities were buried." The giant looked down at him. "Yes?" Edward's voice trembled. "Buried underground." The giant nodded once. Edward suddenly understood something terrifying. The cities weren't destroyed. They were sealed, hidden beneath the earth. An entire world buried beneath the modern one. Edward whispered, "You're trying to come back." The giant met his eyes. "Yes." Behind them, the authority leader lifted his weapon again. "But we will never allow that." At that exact moment, the ground beneath the archive cracked loudly. A deep rumble rolled through the floor. Edward looked down in horror. The stone tiles were splitting apart, and something enormous was pushing upward from below. The giant whisked, purred a single word. Another one. How many creatures were still sleeping beneath the buried cities, waiting to rise again? Chapter 8. The Awakening Below. The crack in the archive floor widened with a violent snap. Stone tiles split apart like broken ice. Dust exploded upward, filling the room with a choking cloud that tasted bitter on Edward's tongue. Edward stumbled back. "What is happening?" he shouted. The rumbling beneath them grew louder, deeper, like thunder trapped underground. The giant beside him stared down at the widening crack, its face grim. "It's too late." Another fracture tore across the floor. Crack. One of the iron shelves collapsed as the ground tilted. Hundreds of old books spilled across the floor, their pages fluttering wildly in the storm wind rushing through the shattered windows. Edward grabbed a nearby desk to steady himself. The authority agents spread apart quickly. "Fall back!" the leader barked. Blue energy surged along their weapons as they aimed toward the floor. Edward's heart pounded violently. "You knew this could happen," he said to the leader. The man didn't look at him. "We always knew." The rumbling intensified. Then something moved beneath the broken stone. Edward saw it clearly. The ground bulged upward from below, as if something enormous was pressing against it. Something alive. Outside the archive, the battle between the guardian giant and the creature shook the entire street. Their roars echoed through the storm like ancient war drums. But the thing beneath the archive was closer, much closer. The giant beside Edward stepped forward. Its massive hand pressed gently against the cracked floor. The stone trembled beneath its touch. "It hears the battle," the giant said quietly. Edward swallowed. "What hears it?" The giant lifted its hand slowly. The stone beneath it suddenly shattered. A massive claw burst through the floor. Edward screamed and jumped back. The claw was enormous, easily the size of a carriage wheel. Thick scales covered its surface, packed with dried mud and broken stone. The smell hit instantly. Rotting earth, ancient soil, something that had been buried far too long. The claw gripped the edge of the broken floor and pulled. The entire center of the archive collapsed inward. Wooden beams snapped. Dust exploded into the air. A massive head pushed up through the rubble. Two glowing yellow eyes opened slowly. Edward's blood turned cold. This creature looked different from the one outside. Its body was smaller, but its eyes burned with a wild, hungry fury. The giant whispered, "A young one." The authority leader's voice cut through the chaos. "Fire!" The agents pulled their triggers. 3 blasts of blue energy slammed into the creature's head. Electric light crackled across its scales. The creature shrieked. The sound pierced Edward's ears like metal scraping glass, but it didn't stop. Instead, the creature climbed higher through the ruined floor, its massive body forcing the hole wider. The giant stepped forward protectively in front of Edward. "You must leave," the giant said. Edward stared up at him. "What about you?" The giant's deep eyes hardened. "We hold the line." Another violent crash sounded outside as the guardian giant slammed the larger creature into a building. The archive shook again. The young creature roared and lunged upward from the hole. The agents fired again. Blue energy exploded across the room. But something unexpected happened. The creature didn't attack the giant. Its glowing eyes locked directly onto Edward. The giant noticed immediately. "No," it whispered. Edward's stomach twisted. "Why is it looking at me?" The giant's voice dropped to a fearful rumble. "Because it can smell you." Edward's breath caught. "Smell me?" The creature hissed loudly. Its massive jaws opened slowly. Rows of jagged teeth glistened in the flickering lantern light. The giant turned to Edward urgently. "You touched the photograph." Edward blinked in confusion. "So?" The giant's voice shook the room. "That photograph came from the buried cities." Edward felt ice run through his veins. "The mud." The giant nodded. "You carry the scent of the buried world." The creature roared and lunged forward. Edward froze. The giant grabbed him suddenly and lifted him off the ground. "Run!" the giant thundered. It hurled Edward toward the archive doorway. Edward crashed into the muddy street outside. Pain shot through his shoulder as he rolled across the wet cobblestones. He looked back. Inside the collapsing archive, the young creature and the giant collided in a violent explosion of stone and wood. And across the street, the much larger monster turned its glowing eyes toward Edward. It sniffed the air slowly. Then it began walking directly toward him. Why were the buried creatures hunting Edward? And what secret had he unknowingly awakened? Chapter 9. The Scent of the Buried. Rain poured from the sky like a broken river. Edward struggled to his feet in the muddy street, his breath coming in short, panicked gasps. The cold rain soaked through his coat instantly, chilling his skin. Behind him, the archive collapsed inward with a deafening crash. Wood splintered. Stone shattered. Dust and smoke billowed into the stormy night. Edward turned slowly. The young creature and the giant were locked together in the ruins, their massive bodies tearing through what remained of the building. Each movement sent debris flying into the street. But Edward barely noticed, because the larger monster had stopped moving. It stood in the rain at the far end of the street, watching him. Its glowing eyes narrowed. Edward felt something deep in his stomach twist with fear. The creature lowered its massive head slightly and inhaled deeply. The sound was wet and heavy, like air being sucked through a cavern. Edward whispered, "Oh no." The creature knew exactly where he was. Behind Edward, several giants stepped cautiously into the street. Their enormous silhouettes loomed through the rain, forming a loose line between the creature and the city beyond. One of them, the Guardian, lifted its massive spear again. The monster ignored them. Its eyes stayed fixed on Edward. The authority leader stepped out of the ruined archive behind him. Rain dripped from his coat as he raised his strange weapon. "You need to move, Mr. Hale," he said calmly. Edward looked at him. "You knew this would happen." The man didn't answer. Instead, he stared at the approaching monster. "It shouldn't be tracking you," the leader muttered. Edward laughed bitterly. "Well, it is." The creature took a step forward. Thoom. The ground cracked beneath its weight. Mud splashed across the street. The giants shifted nervously. Even they seemed uncertain now. Edward backed, away slowly. "Why me?" he demanded. The leader studied him carefully. "You said you found the photograph in the archive." "Yes." "Did you touch anything else?" Edward thought quickly. The maps, the blueprints, the old letters. Then suddenly he remembered something. A small metal object inside the folder. Edward's eyes widened. There was a coin. The leader's expression changed instantly. "A coin?" Edward nodded. "It fell out of the folder when I opened it." The leader's voice dropped. "Did you pick it up?" Edward swallowed. "Yes." The man cursed under his breath. That wasn't a coin. Edward stared at him. Then what was it? The creature roared again. The sound rattled the windows of nearby buildings. The leader spoke quickly now. It's a city marker. Edward blinked. A what? The man pointed toward the ground. It marks the entrance to one of the buried cities. Edward's stomach dropped. You mean the cities the giants were talking about? Yes. Another massive step shook the street. The monster was getting closer. Why would a creature hunt a marker? Edward shouted. The leader answered grimly. Because those creatures were created to destroy the buried cities. Edward's mind spun. You're saying they were weapons? The leader nodded once. Living weapons. Lightning flashed. For a brief moment, Edward saw the creature's enormous body clearly, and something terrifying became obvious. The iron collar around its neck was broken. The chain hanging from it had snapped. Edward whispered in horror. You lost control of it. The leader's face darkened. No. Another roar split the storm. We didn't lose control. He looked directly at Edward. It was released. Edward's chest tightened. By who? The leader slowly turned his gaze toward the giants standing across the street. They want their cities back. At that moment, one of the giants suddenly shouted something in a deep, ancient language. Edward didn't understand the words, but he understood the reaction. All the giants turned toward Edward at once. The guardian stepped forward and pointed directly at him. The giant from the archive ran toward Edward quickly. Give me the marker, it thundered. Edward's pulse exploded with panic. What marker? The giant pointed at Edward's coat pocket. Edward's hand slowly reached inside. His fingers touched cold metal. The coin. Behind him, the monster roared again and began running toward him. Was Edward holding the key to a buried city? And had he just become the most important target on Earth? Chapter 10. The Marker of the Lost City. Rainwater streamed down Edward's face as he stared at the cold metal object in his palm. The coin felt heavier than it should. Its surface was rough and ancient, the edges worn smooth as if countless hands had once passed it through the centuries. Mud and dust clung to the engraved symbol on its face. 3 circles, interlocking, not the authorities' triangles. Something older, something deeper. Edward's heart pounded as the giant from the archive rushed toward him through the rain. Give it to me, the giant thundered. The ground shook violently. Behind Edward, the monstrous creature charged down the street, its massive claws smashing through abandoned carriages and shattered stone. Each step closed the distance. Fast. Too fast. The authority leader stepped forward, raising his weapon. Do not give it to them, Mr. Hale. Edward spun toward him. You said it marks a buried city. Yes, the leader replied sharply. And if the giants recover it, they will open the gates. Lightning flashed across the sky. The giants standing across the street began moving toward Edward now as well, massive shadows approaching through the storm. The guardian raised its enormous spear and shouted something again in the deep, ancient language. Edward couldn't understand the words, but the tone was unmistakable, urgent, desperate. The giant beside him reached out its massive hand. Edward, it said. The deep voice was calmer now. Listen to me. Edward hesitated. Behind him, the monster roared again. The sound vibrated through his ribs. You must trust us. Edward looked up at the towering figure. You said your cities were buried? Yes. And this marker leads to one of them? The giant nodded. The last one near this region. Edward glanced down at the coin again. Rainwater washed across its surface, revealing something new. Tiny carved lines. A map. Edward's breath caught. The lines formed streets, buildings, a circular structure at the center. The giant leaned closer. That city was called Aurelion. Edward whispered the name. Aurelion. The giant's eyes softened for a moment. It was once the greatest city our kind ever built. Another roar split the air. The monster was nearly upon them now. Mud sprayed across the street as it charged forward, its glowing eyes locked onto the coin in Edward's hand. The authority leader shouted, "Mr. Hale, step away from the giant." Edward ignored him. "What's in the city?" he asked. The giant's voice dropped. "Hope." Edward blinked. "Hope?" The giant nodded slowly. "The last place where giants and humans once lived together." Edward stared up at him. "That's impossible." The giant shook its head. "It was hidden after the mud." Behind Edward, the authority agents raised their weapons again. Blue electricity crackled through the coils. "You're being manipulated," the leader warned. "The giants will destroy your civilization the moment they return." Edward turned sharply. "You buried their cities. We saved humanity." Edward's head spun between them, both sides shouting, both claiming the truth. Then the giant spoke one final sentence, a sentence that changed everything. "We didn't bury the cities." Edward froze. "What?" The giant pointed slowly at the authority agents. "They did." The monster roared and lunged forward. The guardian giant stepped in its path, raising the enormous spear. The two giants collided with the creature in a violent explosion of mud and stone. Edward staggered backward. The authority leader stepped closer to him. "Give me the marker," he said quietly. Edward tightened his grip on the coin. The giant beside him whispered urgently, "Edward, if the authority gets the marker, they will seal the city forever." Edward's mind raced. One side wanted the buried city hidden. The other wanted it reopened. The monster hunting him seemed tied to both. Thunder cracked overhead. The leader extended his hand. "Make the right choice." Edward looked at the coin again, at the tiny carved map. And then he noticed something he hadn't seen before. A small arrow carved into the metal, pointing directly toward the hills outside the city. Edward whispered in shock, "It's moving." The giant leaned closer. "What is?" Edward looked up. "The marker." He turned slowly toward the dark hills beyond the storm. The coin in his hand was vibrating faintly and pointing the way toward the entrance of the buried city. But behind him, the monster had just thrown the guardian giant across the street. And now it was coming for Edward again. Was the buried city of Aurelion humanity's salvation, or the beginning of a second forgotten war? Did you know that real giants have actually existed in recorded history? One famous example is Robert Wadlow, known as the Alton Giant. He was the tallest human ever recorded in medical history, reaching 8 feet 11 inches, 2.72 meters, before his death in 1940. His extreme height was caused by a medical condition called pituitary gigantism, where the body produces too much growth hormone. Source: Guinness World Records Medical Studies. But Wadlow wasn't the only one. In the 1800s, a man named Martin Van Buren Bates, often called the Kentucky Giant, stood around 7 feet 9 inches tall. He toured Europe and America and even met Queen Victoria. Source: Historical Records and Biographies from the 19th Century. What makes these cases even more surprising is that the average human height in the 1800s was only about 5 feet 5 inches, 165 centimeters. So people who were over 7 feet tall looked almost unbelievable to ordinary crowds. That's one reason why stories about giants became so common in folklore and old historical reports. But the real mystery is this: if rare giants existed in modern history, could ancient civilizations have had even taller humans that inspired the legends?
Chapter 11. The Road to Aurelion. The coin trembled in Edward's palm, not violently, just enough for him to feel the faint vibration against his skin, like a heartbeat. Edward stared at the tiny arrow carved into the metal. Rain washed mud from its surface, revealing the thin engraved lines of streets and towers. The arrow pointed toward the dark hills beyond the city, toward something buried, toward Aurelion. Behind him, chaos exploded through the storm. The monster roared as it slammed its massive claws into the street where the guardian giant had stood moments before. Cobblestones shattered, mud spraying in every direction. The guardian giant struggled to stand again across the street, its enormous spear bent from the impact. Edward's pulse raced. The creature wasn't just hunting him, it was hunting the marker. The authority leader stepped closer. "Mr. Hale," he said calmly, extending his hand again. "Give it to me." Edward backed away. The giant beside him leaned down urgently. "You must follow the marker." Edward shook his head. "That thing will kill me before I reach the hills." The giant's deep eyes turned toward the creature. "We will slow it." Another roar split the air. The monster's glowing eyes locked on Edward again. The authority leader raised his weapon. "You will not reach the city," he said coldly. Edward frowned. "You're trying to stop me?" "Yes." The man's voice carried no hesitation. "If Aurelion is opened, everything we buried will return." Edward felt anger rise in his chest. "You mean the truth?" Lightning flashed. The leader's expression darkened. The truth destroyed the world once already. The coin in Edward's hand vibrated again, stronger this time. The arrow shifted slightly, still pointing toward the hills. Edward swallowed. "How far?" he asked quietly. The giant answered. 2 miles. Edward stared. 2 miles through a battlefield? The giant nodded. "We will hold them here." Edward looked between the giant and the authority agents, both sides ready to fight. Both convinced they were right. Another thunderous crash echoed behind them. The young creature burst out of the ruins of the archive again, snapping its jaws wildly as it searched for Edward. Now there were 2 monsters in the street. The leader of the authority spoke sharply. "You're out of time." Edward looked down at the coin again. The map seemed clearer now, almost glowing faintly under the rain. He saw something new carved beside the streets. A symbol. A massive circular gate. Edward whispered, "The entrance." The giant nodded. The gate of Aurelion. Edward's mind raced. If he reached it, the buried city might open. If the authorities stopped him, the secret would remain buried forever. The monster roared again, closer, much closer. Edward took a deep breath. Cold rain filled his lungs. Mud squished beneath his boots. He made his decision. Edward turned and ran. "Stop him!" the authority leader shouted. Blue lightning fired from the agent's weapons. The blast struck the street inches from Edward's feet, exploding stone and mud. Edward sprinted down the dark street toward the hills. Behind him the giants moved instantly. The guardian leaped forward, blocking the agents with its enormous body. The giant from the archive followed Edward, taking huge strides beside him. The monster roared in fury and charged after them. Edward ran harder than he ever had in his life. The hills loomed closer through the rain. The coin vibrated wildly now, guiding him, leading him. But suddenly, the ground beneath Edward's feet collapsed. Edward screamed as the street broke apart and he fell into darkness. He slammed into cold stone. The rain disappeared. The air smelled different down here. Old, ancient. Edward slowly lifted his head. Dim light flickered along a massive underground tunnel. Stone walls stretched into the distance, and carved above the tunnel entrance were 2 enormous words. City of Aurelion. Edward's breath caught, because the gate to the buried city was already open. And something inside the darkness had just moved. If the city had been sealed for 200 years, who, or what, had opened the gate? Chapter 12. The Gate Beneath the Earth. Edward lay still on the cold stone floor, his breath echoing in the vast underground chamber. The air down here was thick and damp. It smelled of wet stone, ancient dust, and something metallic, like old iron left too long in the rain. Slowly, he pushed himself up. Pain shot through his shoulder where he had landed, and mud clung to his coat and hands. Above him, the broken street was a distant, jagged hole, rainwater dripping down into the darkness. But Edward barely noticed. His eyes were fixed on the enormous stone archway in front of him.
Carved across its ancient surface were the words, City of Aurelion. The letters were taller than a man. Deep grooves cut into black stone, worn smooth by centuries. Edward swallowed. So it's real, he whispered. The coin in his hand vibrated again. Stronger now, almost warm. He stepped closer to the gate. The tunnel beyond stretched into darkness, but faint lights flickered along the distant walls. Strange lanterns, tall metal structures built into the stone, glowed with a pale golden light. Edward reached out and touched the gate. The stone felt cold and rough beneath his fingers, older than anything he had ever seen. Then he heard it. A sound from deep inside the tunnel. Footsteps. Not giant footsteps. Human. Edward froze. His heart thumped loudly in his ears. "Hello?" he called cautiously. His voice echoed down the ancient corridor. For a moment, there was only silence. Then, a lantern further down the tunnel moved. Someone was carrying it. A shadow appeared on the wall, tall, human-sized. Edward felt a strange mix of relief and fear. "You can come out," he said. "I'm not—" The figure stepped forward into the light. Edward's words died in his throat. The person walking toward him wore a long, dark coat covered in dust and dried mud. Their boots were old, very old, leather cracked with age, but what froze Edward in place was the object hanging from the stranger's neck, a metal coin, identical to the one in Edward's hand. The stranger stopped about 20 feet away. Their lantern cast a soft golden glow across their face. Edward blinked in disbelief. The man looked normal, human. But his eyes were strange, ancient, like someone who had seen centuries pass. The man studied Edward carefully. Then his gaze dropped to the coin in Edward's hand. "You finally found it," the stranger said quietly. Edward frowned. "Found what?" The man stepped closer. "The second marker." Edward's stomach tightened. "Second?" The stranger nodded. "Yes." Edward slowly raised his coin. "So this leads to Aurelion." The man smiled faintly. "It does more than that." Edward felt unease creeping up his spine. "What do you mean?" The stranger lifted the coin hanging from his neck. "This one opens the gate." He pointed toward Edward's coin. "And yours?" The man's voice lowered. "Awakens the city." Edward stared at him. "Who are you?" The man looked back into the dark tunnel behind him. Then he said something that made Edward's blood run cold. "My name used to be Thomas Hale." Edward's mind went blank. "Hale?" The man looked back at him. "Yes?" Edward whispered, "That's my last name." The stranger nodded slowly. "I know." Edward felt the ground spin beneath his feet. "How do you know that?" The man's expression softened slightly. "Because you're the first Hale to return here in 200 years. Edward's breath caught. "My family knew about this place." The man stepped closer. "Your family built it." Edward's head snapped up. "What?" The stranger raised his lantern higher. The golden light illuminated something behind him in the darkness. Something enormous. A massive underground city stretching into the depths of the earth. Stone towers, giant streets, structures large enough for giants, and structures sized for humans. Edward's heart pounded. "It's still alive." The stranger nodded slowly. "Yes," Edward whispered. "But if the city is still alive, who has been living here all this time?" The man looked at him carefully. Then he gave a chilling answer. "Us." Edward blinked. "Us?" The man pointed deeper into the city, where hundreds of lights suddenly flickered on in the darkness. Human voices echoed faintly through the tunnels, and enormous shadows began moving between the towers. "Welcome back," the man said quietly, "to the last hidden city on Earth." But before Edward could respond,
A distant roar echoed down the tunnel behind him. The monsters had found the entrance, and they were coming underground. Had Edward just awakened the last safe city on Earth, or led the buried monsters directly to it? Chapter 13. The City That Never Died. The roar rolled through the tunnel like thunder trapped beneath the earth. Edward spun toward the entrance of the passage. From far above, rubble shifted, and small stones rained down from the cracked ceiling. The monsters had found the opening, and they were coming. Behind him, the hidden city of Aurelion flickered to life. Hundreds of lanterns ignited along massive stone streets. Warm golden light spread slowly through the underground cavern, revealing towers, bridges, and enormous gates carved into the rock. The air here smelled different from the muddy storm outside. Fresh bread, wood smoke, warm metal from blacksmith forges. Edward blinked in disbelief. This place, it's alive. Thomas Hale nodded quietly. It always was. Edward stepped forward into the city entrance. His boots scraped against ancient stone streets worn smooth by centuries of footsteps. Human footsteps. Giant footsteps. Both. Edward could hear voices now. Children laughing somewhere deeper in the city. Metal tools striking anvils. Doors opening. People were waking up. From balconies and towers, figures appeared holding lanterns. Some were human-sized, others were enormous. Giants. But these giants looked different from the warriors outside. Their clothing was simple, woven from thick fabrics, stained with dust and work. Builders, farmers, craftsmen. They stared toward the tunnel entrance with growing alarm. "They know the monsters are coming," Edward whispered. Thomas nodded. "They've been waiting." Edward looked at him sharply. "Waiting for what?" Thomas lifted his lantern toward Edward's hand. "For you." Edward froze. "For me?" Thomas pointed at the coin Edward still held. "The second marker." Edward frowned. "You said it awakens the city." "Yes." Thomas's voice echoed softly through the enormous chamber. "The first marker opens the gate." He lifted the coin, around his neck. "The second one wakes the guardians." Edward's stomach tightened. "Guardians?" Thomas turned and gestured toward the center of the underground city. Edward followed his gaze. At the far end of the cavern stood something enormous, larger than any building. A massive circular platform surrounded by towering stone statues. Dozens of them, each statue shaped like a giant warrior. Spears, shields, armor carved in incredible detail. Edward squinted through the flickering lantern light. "They're statues." Thomas's voice lowered. "Not exactly." Another roar thundered down the tunnel behind them. Closer now. Much closer. The ground trembled. People in the city began shouting orders. Giant workers hurried through the streets, carrying massive chains and iron weapons. Edward turned back to Thomas. "The monsters are almost here." Thomas nodded. "Yes." Edward pointed at the statues. "So how do these guardians help us?" Thomas stepped closer and placed his lantern beside the circular platform. "Place the marker there." Edward hesitated. "Why?" Thomas looked him directly in the eyes. "Because those statues are not statues." Edward felt a chill spread across his skin. "What are they then?" Thomas's voice dropped to a whisper. "The last sleeping army of Aurelion." Another violent roar exploded through the tunnel. Dust fell from the ceiling. Edward could now hear the monsters crawling down the stone passage behind him, claws scraping rock. Closer every second. Thomas pointed to the center of the platform. "Hurry!" Edward stepped forward slowly. The coin vibrated wildly now. The statues loomed around him in a massive circle. Their carved stone eyes seemed to watch him. Edward's hand trembled as he lifted the coin. "If I place this—" Thomas nodded. "They will wake." Edward swallowed. "And if they wake—" Thomas turned toward the tunnel entrance where the shadows of the monsters were beginning to appear. Then he gave an answer that made Edward's blood run cold. "They will decide if humanity deserves to survive." Edward froze. "What do you mean, decide?" Thomas looked back at him. "Because the guardians of Aurelion were built to judge both giants and humans."
Another deafening roar shook the cavern. The first monster burst into the tunnel entrance. Its glowing eyes locked onto Edward instantly. Thomas shouted, "Place the marker now!" Edward looked at the coin, then at the towering stone army around him, and realized something terrifying. Every statue's stone eyes were already slowly turning toward him. If the Guardians were waking, were they here to save humanity or to destroy it? Chapter 14. The Judgment of Stone. The monster's roar shook the cavern like an earthquake. Dust cascaded from the ceiling as the creature burst fully into the underground tunnel. Its enormous body scraped the stone walls, claws tearing deep grooves through ancient rock. Edward's heart slammed against his ribs. The statues around the circular platform were moving. Not fast, but enough. The faint grinding sound of stone against stone echoed through the cavern. Thomas shouted again, "Place the marker!" Edward's hand trembled above the center of the platform. The coin vibrated violently now, almost burning his palm. Around him, the massive statues slowly turned their heads. Stone eyes focusing, watching him, judging him. Another roar exploded from the tunnel. The monster lunged forward into the cavern, its glowing eyes locked onto Edward. Behind it, a second creature forced its way through the narrow passage. Two monsters, both hunting the marker. Edward hesitated. "You said they judge humans too." Thomas nodded urgently. "Yes." Edward's voice shook. "What if they decide we don't deserve to survive?" Thomas didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked toward the streets of Aurelion. Hundreds of humans and giants had gathered there now, watching the platform in tense silence. Families, workers, children, all waiting. Thomas finally spoke quietly. "Then at least the truth will finally decide our fate." The monster charged across the cavern floor. Each step cracked the stone like thunder. The giants in the city rushed forward to slow it, throwing massive chains and iron spears. The creature smashed through them like twigs. Edward could feel the ground trembling beneath his boots. The statues around the platform were now turning fully toward him, their stone armor grinding, their giant spears shifting. A deep sound rumbled beneath the platform. Not a roar. A voice. Ancient. "Poe, Werfel. Who awakens Aurelion?" The sound vibrated through Edward's chest. Everyone in the cavern froze. The monsters paused for a brief moment. Even they seemed to feel it. Edward's throat tightened. That's one of them," Thomas whispered. "The first Guardian." The platform beneath Edward's feet began glowing faintly with golden light. The coin in his hand pulsed in response. The voice echoed again. "Who claims the marker of the city?" Edward swallowed. Thousands of eyes were watching him now. Humans, giants, and the stone army. The monster roared again and lunged forward. Closer. Too close. Edward knew he had seconds. He stepped forward and placed the coin onto the center of the platform. The moment it touched the stone, the entire cavern exploded with light. Golden energy shot upward from the platform like a pillar. The statues around him began cracking, stone armor splitting apart, huge fragments falling to the ground. Edward stared upward in awe. The statues weren't hollow. Inside them were enormous metallic giants. Machines, ancient war machines. Their eyes ignited with bright blue light, one by one, dozens of them. The first Guardian rose from its broken stone shell. It stood twice the height of any living giant. Metal armor covered its body like an ancient knight. Its voice boomed through the cavern. "The city of Aurelion is awakened." The monster roared and charged again, but this time the Guardian moved. Faster than anything Edward had ever seen, it raised its enormous blade, and with one massive strike, the creature was thrown across the cavern like a rag doll. The ground shook violently as it crashed into a distant tower. The awakened Guardians stepped forward as one, an army of towering metal giants. The first Guardian turned its glowing eyes toward Edward. Edward's breath caught. The machine spoke again. "The judgment begins." Edward's stomach twisted. Judgment? The first Guardian raised its massive hand. Humans and giants will both be tested. The monsters roared again from the tunnel. More were coming. Many more. The Guardian army turned toward the tunnel entrance, preparing for war. But the first Guardian kept its glowing eyes fixed on Edward. You carry the blood of the Founders. Edward blinked in shock. The Founders? The machine stepped closer, its enormous metal face lowering toward him. You will decide the fate of both worlds. Edward felt the weight of those words crash down on him. Then the Guardian pointed toward the tunnel, where at least 5 more monsters were crawling toward the city. Command us. Edward's heart pounded. Because the army of Aurelion was now waiting for his order, and whatever he chose next would decide the future of giants, humans, and the buried world itself. Should Edward lead the Guardians into war, or uncover the secret that created the monsters in the first place? Chapter 15. The Choice of War. The cavern trembled as another monstrous roar tore through the tunnel. 5 creatures now crawled toward the city of Aurelion, their massive bodies scraping the stone passage. Their glowing eyes burned like distant fires in the darkness. Edward stood frozen at the center of the platform. Before him towered the awakened army of Aurelion, dozens of ancient metal guardians, each taller than the giants themselves. Their blue-lit eyes glowed like cold stars in the underground city, and they were all waiting for him. The first Guardian lowered its enormous blade and spoke again. Command us! Edward's heart pounded so hard he could feel it in his throat. Behind him, the people of Aurelion watched in tense silence. Humans stood beside giants, their faces lit by the golden lanterns that flickered along the streets. Thomas stepped closer to Edward. You must decide quickly, he said. Edward gestured toward the tunnel where the monsters approached. There's nothing to decide. We have to stop them. Thomas nodded slowly. Yes. Edward looked at the massive war machines. So we send them. The first Guardian waited patiently. Edward lifted his head. Guardians of Aurelion, he said, his voice echoing through the cavern. Defend the city. The metal army moved instantly. With thunderous steps, the Guardians marched toward the tunnel entrance. Each step shook the stone streets beneath them. The first monster lunged forward with a furious roar. The first Guardian raised its massive blade. The clash was explosive. Steel struck scale with a sound like a collapsing mountain. Sparks flew as the creature's claws scraped across the Guardian's armor. Another Guardian drove a spear through the monster's side. The creature shrieked and thrashed wildly, but more monsters poured into the tunnel behind it. Edward watched in horror. There are too many. Thomas's expression darkened. Yes. Edward turned sharply. You said these things were created to destroy the buried cities. Thomas nodded. They were weapons built during the Old War. Edward frowned. Then who built them? Thomas hesitated. For the first time he looked uneasy. The same people who built Aurelion. Edward's stomach dropped. You mean humans? Thomas gave a slow nod. Humans and giants, together. Edward stared at him. Why would they create monsters like that? Thomas looked toward the battle raging in the tunnel. Because the war was worse than anything you can imagine. Another Guardian was thrown violently across the cavern by one of the creatures. The metal warrior slammed into a stone tower, leaving a deep crater in the wall. Edward clenched his fists. This isn't a battle, he said. It's a disaster. Thomas turned back to him. There is another option. Edward blinked. What option? Thomas pointed toward the platform behind them. The city core. Edward frowned. What does that do? Thomas's voice dropped. It controls the ancient systems of Aurelion. Edward felt a chill run through him. What kind of systems? Thomas met his eyes. The ones that buried the world 200 years ago. Edward's breath caught. The mud. Thomas nodded. Yes. Edward's mind spun. You're saying the city can do it again? Thomas looked toward the approaching monsters. If the core is activated, the entire region above us will collapse. Edward's eyes widened. You mean bury everything again? Yes. Edward stepped back. That would wipe out the entire city above. Thomas nodded grimly. But it would seal the monsters underground forever. Edward looked back toward the tunnel. The Guardians were fighting fiercely, but the monsters kept coming. More shadows moved deeper in the tunnel. Dozens of them. Edward whispered. How many are there? Thomas answered quietly. Thousands. Edward's chest tightened. Then he realized something even worse. If the monsters reached the surface, they wouldn't stop at one city. They would spread across the world. Edward turned slowly toward the glowing platform. Two choices stood before him. Fight the monsters with the Guardians, or bury the entire region again, possibly destroying everything above. Edward whispered, How did the war end last time? Thomas looked away. It didn't. Another monstrous roar echoed through the cavern. The first Guardian shouted across the battlefield, The enemy multiplies! Edward felt the terrible weight of the decision pressing down on him, because whatever he chose next would either save the world or bury it, again beneath the mud. Should Edward activate the ancient system and seal the monsters forever, or risk unleashing them onto the surface of Earth? Chapter 16. The Second Flood. The cavern shook again. Another Guardian was hurled across the stone streets as a monster slammed into it with terrifying force. The metal warrior crashed into a tower, sparks bursting from its armor. Edward stared at the battlefield in horror. The Guardians were powerful, but the monsters were endless. From the dark tunnel, more glowing eyes appeared. 10, 20, then dozens. Each one crawling closer to Aurelion. The first Guardian shouted across the chaos, The city will fall if the core is not activated. Edward clenched his fists. Behind him, the glowing platform pulsed softly in the darkness. The city core, the device that had buried the world once before. Thomas stepped beside him. You see the truth now, he said quietly. Edward's voice trembled. You buried the surface cities 200 years ago to stop these things. Thomas nodded. Yes. Edward turned toward him. How many people died when the mud came? Thomas didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked toward the city above them, though it was hidden beneath miles of earth. Millions, he said finally. Edward felt sick. You wiped out entire civilizations. Thomas nodded again. To save the rest of the world. Another thunderous crash shook the cavern. A Guardian stabbed its massive spear through one of the creatures, pinning it against the tunnel wall. But 3 more monsters leapt over the body. Edward stared at the battlefield. If these things reach the surface... Thomas finished the sentence quietly. Human civilization ends. Edward's chest tightened. The first Guardian stepped backward from the battle and turned toward Edward again. Its blue eyes burned like cold fire. The decision must be made now. Edward looked at the platform, then at the people of Aurelion. Humans, giants, both watching him, both trusting him. He whispered, If we activate the core, what happens? Thomas answered, The earth above collapses. Edward imagined the modern city above them. Homes, families, millions of people living normal lives, unaware of the ancient war beneath their feet. They'll all die, Edward said. Thomas's voice was heavy. Yes. Another monster burst from the tunnel. Then another. The Guardians struggled to hold them back. Edward's breathing grew faster. The coin in his pocket vibrated again. Not pointing now, just pulsing, almost as if it knew the choice that had to be made. Edward closed his eyes. He could smell the metal from the Guardian's armor, the wet stone of the cavern, the smoke from distant fires in the city. He heard the screams of battle echoing through the tunnels. Then he opened his eyes again. I won't bury the world. Thomas stared at him. Edward. No. Edward stepped toward the platform, but instead of placing the coin inside the core, he slammed it into a different slot carved beside it. A hidden slot. One Thomas had never mentioned. The platform suddenly changed. Golden light shifted to deep blue. Thomas's eyes widened. "What did you just do?" Edward looked up calmly. "I read the map on the marker." The ground trembled violently. Deep mechanisms inside the city roared to life. The first Guardian turned suddenly. Its voice boomed across the cavern. "Unknown system activated." Thomas grabbed Edward's arm. "That system was never meant to be used." Edward nodded. "I know." A deep rumble spread through the entire underground city. Then far above them, something massive moved beneath the earth. The monsters froze for a moment. Even the Guardians paused. Edward whispered, "If the first flood buried the world." He looked toward the ceiling of the cavern. "Then maybe the second one doesn't have to." Thomas stared at him in disbelief. "You didn't activate the burial system." Edward shook his head. "No." The rumbling grew louder. The ground beneath the monsters began to crack open. Massive stone plates shifted apart like opening jaws. Thomas whispered in shock, "You're opening the ancient gates." Edward nodded slowly. "Yes." Suddenly the tunnel floor collapsed. One of the Mons, Ters, fell screaming into the darkness below, then another, and another. Deep beneath Aurelion, enormous underground caverns were opening, a prison far older than the city itself. The first Guardian looked down into the abyss. Its voice echoed across the cavern. "The abyssal vaults have been reopened." Thomas stared at Edward. "You're not burying them?" Edward shook his head. "No." Another monster fell into the endless darkness below. "I'm locking them away." But just as the battle seemed to turn, the largest monster yet burst into the cavern, 3 times bigger than the others. Its massive body smashed through the Guardians like a living mountain. The creature roared louder than anything before, and this one was not wearing a broken collar. It had no chains. Thomas whispered in terror, "That's the Alpha." Edward felt his stomach drop. Because if the smaller monsters had nearly destroyed the city, this one looked unstoppable. The Alpha monster slowly turned its glowing eyes toward Edward and began walking straight toward him. Had Edward saved the world, or just awakened the true ruler of the buried monsters? Chapter 17. The Alpha Awakens. The Alpha stepped into the cavern like a walking mountain. Each movement cracked the ancient stone floor beneath its enormous claws. The remaining Guardians braced themselves, raising their massive weapons as blue light burned in their mechanical eyes. But even they seemed smaller now. Edward's breath caught in his throat. The Alpha monster was unlike the others. Its skin was darker, almost black, like hardened lava. Thick ridges ran across its back, each one taller than a man. Its glowing eyes burned with a deep crimson light instead of yellow. And there were no chains, no collar, nothing to control it. Thomas whispered beside Edward, his voice trembling, "That creature, it was never meant to wake." The Alpha roared. The sound slammed into the cavern walls and echoed through Aurelion like an ancient war horn. Several humans in the city screamed and ran for cover. Even the giants stepped backward. The first Guardian lifted its massive blade and stepped forward to meet the monster. Primary threat identified. The Alpha lunged, faster than anything Edward had seen. Its enormous claws smashed into the first Guardian with devastating force. The metal giant slid backward across the stone street, leaving a deep scar in the ground. Sparks exploded from its armor. The Alpha roared again. 2 more Guardians rushed forward. One drove its spear into the monster's side. The weapon shattered instantly. The Alpha turned and crushed the Guardian with a single swipe. The metal warrior collapsed into twisted steel. Edward felt cold dread settle in his chest. "They can't stop it." Thomas nodded slowly. "No." The Alpha took another step forward. Now it was looking directly at Edward again, the same way the smaller monsters had, like it recognized him. Edward whispered, "Why does it keep staring at me?" Thomas suddenly looked at the coin slot on the platform, then back at Edward. His face turned pale. "You activated the ancient vault system." "Yes." Thomas swallowed hard. "Edward, the Alpha wasn't locked inside the vaults." Edward felt his stomach drop. "Then where was it?" Thomas pointed slowly toward the ceiling of the cavern. "The Alpha has always been here." Edward stared. "What?" Thomas's voice shook. "It was the guardian of the monsters." Edward's mind raced. "So, when I opened the vaults—" Thomas finished the sentence quietly. "You woke their king." The Alpha roared again and charged forward. The first guardian intercepted it, slamming its massive blade into the creature's chest. The Alpha barely slowed. With terrifying strength, it grabbed the guardian's arm and ripped it off. Metal tore like paper. The first guardian stumbled back. Edward felt panic rising in his chest. "We can't win this." Thomas looked toward the city behind them. Thousands of people were hiding in the streets. Humans, giants, children. If the Alpha reached them, Edward turned back toward the platform. "There has to be another system." Thomas shook his head slowly. "There is one." Edward looked at him. "What is it?" Thomas hesitated. "The Founder's Protocol." Edward frowned. "What does it do?" Thomas looked him directly in the eyes. "It ends the war." Edward felt a flicker of hope. "How?" Thomas's voice dropped to a whisper. "It destroys Aurelion." Edward froze. "What?" Thomas nodded. "The entire city." Edward shook his head. "You're insane." Thomas pointed at the Alpha monster ripping through the Guardians. "If that creature reaches the surface, the world ends." Edward clenched his fists. "So your solution is to destroy the only safe place left?" Thomas's voice was heavy. "It's what the Founders planned." The Alpha roared again and smashed another Guardian into the ground. Only a few defenders remained. The first Guardian looked toward Edward one last time. Final defense failing. Edward's heart pounded. The Founders' Protocol. Destroy the city, kill the Alpha, save the world, but sacrifice everyone in Aurelion. Edward whispered, "There has to be another way." Then suddenly, the coin slot on the platform began glowing again, bright, stronger than before. Edward frowned. "I didn't activate anything else." Thomas stared at the platform in shock. "You didn't." Edward looked at him. "Then who did?" At that moment, a new voice echoed across the cavern, ancient, calm, and far more powerful than the Guardians. "The final Founder has awakened." The Alpha monster stopped moving, for the first time since the battle began. It slowly turned its head toward the center of the city. Edward followed its gaze, and his heart nearly stopped, because a massive stone door deep inside Aurelion was opening, and something even larger than the Guardians was beginning to rise from within it. Was the final Founder humanity's last hope, or the true creator of the monsters themselves? Chapter 18. The Last Founder. The cavern fell silent. Even the Alpha monster stopped moving. Its massive chest rose and fell slowly as its glowing red eyes fixed on the enormous stone door opening in the center of Aurelion. Edward felt the air change. The smell of dust and metal faded, replaced by something older, warmer, like ancient earth after rain. The ground trembled. Stone cracked. The door slowly split apart, revealing a chamber hidden behind it for centuries. Thomas whispered beside Edward, his voice shaking. That chamber. It was sealed before the mud. Edward's heart pounded. Who is the final Founder? Thomas didn't answer, because something inside the chamber moved. A massive shape rose from the darkness. At first, Edward thought it was another Guardian. But this one was different, far larger. nearly the size of the Alpha monster itself. Its body was made of the same ancient metal as the Guardians, but its armor was covered in strange glowing symbols. Soft golden light flowed through the carvings like liquid fire. The enormous machine stepped forward. Each movement echoed like distant thunder. The Alpha growled low in its throat. For the first time since it appeared, the monster looked uncertain. The giant machine's voice filled the cavern. Deep, calm, older than everything around it. "I am the first architect." Edward stared in disbelief. "The first founder?" Thomas nodded slowly. "Yes." The machine turned its glowing eyes toward the Alpha. "The war was never meant to return." The Alpha roared and lunged forward. The first architect moved, not fast, but perfectly. Its enormous hand caught the monster's claw in mid-air. Stone cracked beneath their feet. The Alpha pushed harder, roaring in rage. But the architect didn't move. Its voice echoed again. "You were created to protect the world." Edward frowned. "Protect?" Thomas whispered. "The monsters weren't weapons." The architect continued. "Until humans turned you into one." The Alpha roared louder, thrashing violently. Edward realized something terrifying. The monster wasn't attacking blindly. It was angry, furious. The architect lifted its other hand and touched the Alpha's head gently. Golden light spread across the creature's dark skin. The monster's roar slowly faded. The glowing red eyes dimmed. Then the creature stopped fighting. The cavern fell completely silent. Edward whispered, "You didn't destroy it?" Thomas shook his head slowly. "No." The architect's voice echoed once more. "The war was a lie." Edward looked up. "What do you mean?" The massive machine turned its glowing gaze toward him. "Giants and humans did not destroy the world." Edward's breath caught. "Then who did?" The architect answered calmly. "Fear." Images suddenly lit across the cavern walls, ancient holographic memories projected by the city core. Edward saw the past. Humans and giants building Aurelion together, creating guardians, creating the great creatures to protect nature and the earth. But then something changed. Humans began fearing the giants' strength. Giants feared human machines. Arguments became battles. Battles became war. And finally, someone triggered the mud system. Not to save the world, but to hide the truth. The architect looked down at Edward. "You have ended the cycle." Edward whispered, "How?" The machine gestured toward the now calm Alpha creature. "By choosing not to destroy." The Alpha slowly lowered its massive head. The other monsters in the tunnel retreated into the darkness. The Guardians powered down their weapons. Peace returned to the cavern. Edward looked around the city. Humans and giants stood side by side in stunned silence. The architect spoke one final time. "The world above has forgotten its past." Edward nodded slowly. "Yes." The machine's glowing eyes softened. "It is time they remember." The ground above Aurelion trembled gently. Hidden gates across the earth began opening. Ancient cities long buried beneath mud and stone slowly awakened, the truth rising after 200 years. Edward looked toward the distant tunnel leading back to the surface. The world above was about to discover something impossible. Giants had never vanished. The buried cities had never died. And the greatest secret in human history was finally waking up. Edward took a deep breath. A new world was about to begin. And this time, it would not be built on lies. The end.